and a course coordinator at the United States Foreign Service Institute. Joseph currently serves as the executive director of the national security think tank Center for a Secure Free Society. Prior to that, he served in the U.S. Marine Corps with a combat tour in Iraq and a multinational training exercise in Latin America and the Caribbean. Our moderator today is Eric Brimmen. Eric is the CEO and chairman of the board at Honduras Prospera. Eric started his career in investment banking at Brown Brothers Harriman and Company before working as an M&A advisor for A.G. Edwards and Sons, which is now Wells Fargo. He then joined Ernst & Young's London advisory practice. If you'd like to learn more about today's speakers and moderator, their full bios can be viewed on our website, fedsoc.org. After our speaker gives his presentation, we will turn to you, the audience, for questions. If you have a question, please enter it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will do our best to answer as many as we can. Finally, I'll note that, as always, all expressions of opinion today are those of our guest speakers, not the Federalist Society. With that, Eric, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Caroline. Welcome to our distinguished guests, and Joseph and Ryan. This panel obviously is very timely. Much is being said about the reemergent importance of Latin America, and we could not be better accompanied for this discussion than with Joseph and Ryan. We're going to go through various topics, and your questions will guide a lot of the discussion. But high level, the four key items I want to make sure we cover include: why does it matter that some of these actors are gaining influence in our hemisphere, China in particular? How are they going about it, and how do we know? What should those countries in the hemisphere that are friendly and aligned to the US consider red lines versus normal trade relations? And then what are some of the promising ways to counter these influences, again, in particular with regards to China? To start us off, Joseph, I would like to invite you to give some opening remarks. But first, I wanted to mention that in my job, I have the privilege to work with a lot of experts in the hemisphere. One of the things that, in my experience, sets Joseph apart is that not only does he do a great job at the academic level, but he's actually somebody very much willing to roll up his sleeves, show up on the ground, look at things firsthand, not just read about them. And I think that makes all the difference. So with that firsthand experience, Joseph, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Eric. Thank you to everybody. Thank you to the Federalist Society for organizing this. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for Ryan for participating. I'm a big fan of all your work as well at CSIS. And I'll begin actually by doing a quick apology for my voice. I'm recovering from this nasty cold that's spreading all through Washington, D.C. So if I'm a little nasally, it's because of that. And in essence, I'll push through. I'm going to take a step back, and Eric's right. I do like to go to Latin America quite a bit. I used to travel a lot more than sometimes I would want, but I did like to see things firsthand, be on the ground, and I think you learn a lot from that. It's becoming a little bit more difficult in specific countries to get down there as it becomes a little bit more dangerous, particularly for Americans. But I think in essence, I think we're starting to enter this, what I call Western Hemisphere's moment, and a lot has to do with what a difference an election makes. And I think President Trump has essentially drove in this new focus on Latin America, on Canada, on the entire hemisphere. And I think that it's now encompassed on all of us to essentially fill in the dots. And I also want to say that one of the reasons I think we're moving into Western Hemisphere moment is because this is the second webinar I've done this month with the Federal Society where we touched on Latin America. So just the fact, I want to give kudos to the Federal Society for doing at least 2 webinars in January looking at the region, one from the perspective of the border and immigration, and now today we're going to talk a little bit more about the region itself. I mentioned President Trump, and I think obviously this is taken a kind of a front line in the news, what he said with Greenland, Canada, Mexico, obviously the Panama Canal, and what's now called the Gulf of America. And you can say all that in one breath. And that conversation really has to do with something that's been sorely lacking in our foreign policy, and something that's been tremendously detrimental to our national security, which is our security perimeter. You know, everyone understands the detriments and the consequences of our border security, both our northern border and our southern border. But those that really wrap their heads around those issues understand that those challenges, those problems manifest itself well beyond the border into our near abroad. And for as long as I've been working in U.S. foreign policy and national security circles, there's been a lack of strategic focus on Latin America in terms of that context, in terms of understanding our near abroad, where the United States can gain its most competitive advantage. And I think that President Trump is now trying to draw that strategic map, everything from Greenland up in the Arctic down to the Panama Canal and even beyond, to make Americans understand that this is the most crucial region for our stability, for our security, for our prosperity. And in order to make America great again, you have to make the Americas great again. And I think that that conversation has now begun. And so what I'd like to do for the few minutes that I begin is to talk a little bit about how we got here. And I'm going to begin, 200 years ago, because I honestly don't think we've had a really big grand strategy for Latin America arguably since the Monroe Doctrine. And I understand the Monroe Doctrine in many respects has a negative connotation, particularly in Latin America, because it draws kind of glimpses and flashes of reminders of interventions in the 20th century. But in reality, I mean, the Monroe Doctrine, and we got to go back to 1823 when it was signed by President James Monroe, was not an interventionist foreign policy by no stretch in imagination. In fact, the Secretary of State, and was largely the architect of the doctrine itself, John Quincy Adams, is famous for specifically saying, "America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy." It was very much not an interventionist president when he became president, but was an interventionist Secretary of State. What the Monroe Doctrine was a defensive posture. It was a very bold move by a burgeoning power. We were not a world power at the time, back in the 19th century, but it was a bold move to essentially say the New World is off limits, and that the New World shares this kind of common history of being part of these new republics. And in many respects, to me, it was a seed of sovereignty that was sowed throughout the entire hemisphere. Many of the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean began to sow their sovereignty and began to really solidify their independence. That began around the same time in the 19th century. And I think in part because the Monroe Doctrine was something that was boldly proclaimed by the United States. You transfer that into the 21st century, into the 20th century, the 19th to 20th century, and then you get the Roosevelt Corollary, which people attach to the Monroe Doctrine, and then you get a lot of the interventions throughout the 20th century. But in fact, I want to focus on another corollary that I think is in many ways more relevant to today than Roosevelt's corollary, which is a corollary called the Lodge Corollary. So Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, a Republican from Massachusetts, introduced this corollary. I think it was if I remember right, it was in the 1920s. And what it had to do, and it was also tied to the Monroe Doctrine, it had to do with, at the time, Japanese state-owned or controlled companies beginning to buy up strategic sites in Mexico, particularly in Baja California. And what that did was it drove a kind of an awareness that the only concern isn't necessarily just militaries or old monarchies coming into the new world and starting to be able to position themselves that would be adversarial or potentially hostile to U.S. interests. And at the time, they were talking about Imperial Japan. But also because they can use private enterprise. They can use companies to do so. And this was back in the early part of the 20th century. That is very apropos to today, when what we're seeing with China, and to begin to see how you can basically subvert the commercial endeavors of a country to basically use those as dual-use purpose for military or other strategic ambitions. And so I think that the Monroe Doctrine still has a lot of weight to have a conversation today, and I think we have to kind of push past a lot of the misperceptions and probably some even potentially the misgivings that can have it, but it has to be in some ways renewed towards a modern doctrine. People are calling things now the Trump Doctrine, and I think there's an opportunity to have a Trump Doctrine that looks at our near abroad in a strategic way, in ways that no other president has done, at least in my time, and certainly not in the 20th century. And that brings me to the Panama Canal, because obviously this has made a lot of headlines in the beginning part of this year. And a lot of people have made comments, and I've made this comment on a couple of interviews that I've done recently, but the first reaction that I often got from journalists was, well, we think that this perhaps is a part of a negotiation, right? It's a negotiation strategy that you tend to, ratchet up the concessions or the demands, and then you can roll it back to get to what you really want to, whether it's immigration or whatnot. And I don't necessarily see it that way. I think this is much more national security than any kind of negotiation. Obviously, there's negotiations involved in all bilateral conversations, but I think some things are also non-negotiable. The United States would not allow any hostile actor to attack us from within that security perimeter. That is non-negotiable. And then when you have Russian nuclear submarines passing through the Florida Straits, or you have a Cuba Signals Intelligence Station on the western side of Cuba, which CSIS has done a great job at reporting on, or Iranian activity starting to position along nuclear stations in Merida, Mexico, or a spy balloon, and I'm not talking the spy balloon that crossed through North America, but a second spy balloon that crossed through the Panama Canal, or at least over near the Panama Canal. These are things, these are signs, these are warnings that are telling us that our adversaries are starting to figure out how to make a checkmate on the United States. The Panama Canal is one of the biggest strategic waterways in the world. It's obviously the most relevant to the United States. It's 7% of global shipping, 40% of U.S. container traffic, and upwards of 70% of anything that comes and goes from U.S. ports. The detriment to a U.S. economy, if anything is done to the Panama Canal, is disastrous. And I think it's incumbent on us, the United States, our foreign policy and national security, to get ahead of that and to make sure that does not happen. And then in that, I think, one of the things that we have to think about is, and I get this question too, like, well, why be so aggressive with allies, right? And I push back to that and I say, well, this is the reason we're having this conversation, is because they're an ally. Because if Panama was an adversary, if Panama was Venezuela, this would be a different conversation. The reason we're able to have this conversation is because Panama's a friend. Panama's an ally. In fact, President Molino is a very good friend. I think he likes the United States quite a bit. I think he likes President Trump quite a bit as well. But these are the type of questions and the type of conversations, tough conversations, but we need to have about mutual strategic interests. It's not to the benefit of Panama to have anything happen to its country, to its canal, or to anything that would detriment their security, but then their security would impact our national security. So we have to figure this out. And I think doing this in a very transparent and open way is much better than doing it through closed doors and back channels. And I think that once we position this up top, and maybe many in Latin America are accustomed to doing everything through back channels and closed doors, but that's frankly, obviously not the way that President Trump likes to do things, but I also don't think it's very productive, because when you're forthcoming and you're transparent, you can allow the conversation to grow into the public policy sphere. And in that, I want to dominate my time. I want to obviously give a lot of time to Ryan to talk, and we could get the conversation, but I just want to end a little bit with saying, I think this is an opportune moment for all of us, Ryan, myself, Eric, everyone that's been working on Latin America. We've been waiting for this moment because we've always kind of felt like the stepchilds of U.S. foreign policy when everyone talks about the Middle East. And I cut my teeth in the Middle East. I spent time deployed in Iraq. I did a lot of work in Iran and counterterrorism. And I remember those kind of conversations, especially with my friends in special operations, would say, Joseph, we got migraines in Latin America, but we got headaches in Latin America, but we got migraines in the Middle East. And I often remind them a headache turns into a migraine if you don't attend to it. And a migraine in Latin America would be probably more detrimental than a migraine in the Middle East. Nonetheless, we all know that there's a lot of hotspots around the world. There's a lot of priorities. There's a lot of challenges and opportunities. But nothing really makes more sense than the part of the world where we trade the most, where we talk the most, where we do the most tourism. I mean, it's common sense in many respects. And I think that common sense has come back to the White House. And you're starting to see that. And I think Ryan had a good op-ed recently about kind of a Latin America first approach, and you see it with the cabinet appointments, Secretary Rubio, the Deputy Secretary Chris Landau, who spent a lot of time as a son of diplomats in Latin America, was former ambassador to Mexico. I know Mike Waltz has a lot of experience at the National Security Council, National Security Advisor with Latin America. I even know Pete Hegseth. I spent some time talking to Pete Hegseth, and I know he has a lot of thoughts about our near abroad as well, and our military and defensive positioning. So I think we have a tremendous opportunity now for us Latin Americanists to really fill the gaps, right? The president has laid a blueprint. He has laid this strategic map along the security perimeter. And it's now up to us to really fulfill that and to really develop this as a real grand strategy for the Western Hemisphere. We read the first grand strategy that I've seen in my lifetime that's really tangible and tactical. And when you start to get into geopolitics, it's not about adversaries and allies. It's about geography. And we have to have a renewed geography and understanding how the geographic makeup of Latin America. When you have epithets of trade, like a term called the Northern Triangle, which is not a real geographic makeup, but you had that become part of a bureaucratic department, at the State Department, you're now complicating what could actually be a much more simplistic process. So I think I think Latin America is our area of affinity, it's our security perimeter, and it potentially could be our arc of stability if we can have a grand strategy for the Western Hemisphere that meets the needs of the U.S. national security and foreign policy. And I'll just end with this. I think if you win in the Western Hemisphere, you win all over the world, and that includes against China. So I'll end there.
Super. Great. Thanks very much, Joseph. And to the audience, I'd like to remind you Please feel free to type questions as they come up. They will show up in a log, and that way I in particular can be reading them and planning to present them to the panel. Next up, Dr. Berg or Ryan. You all know him, obviously. He's a top-notch personality in the space. I would say one of the things that really stands out to me about his work and CSIS is not just talking about what is relevant, but really making an effort at coming up with solutions that could be pragmatically implemented. And you see that through Ryan's work. And so thank you very much, Ryan, for your time. We'd love to have your opening remarks now as well.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Eric, to the Federalist Society, and to Joseph for making the time to be here at this important conversation. I concur entirely with Joseph. This is a Latin America administration. If you're a Latin Americanist, this is the best time to be working on Latin America. The president has put this issue front and center of the foreign policy agenda. For those of us who have been working Latin America, in my case, about a decade now, in Joseph's case, probably even longer. Eric, you've been in this space a long time as well. This is our moment. We haven't had a moment where there is such an acute focus on our shared neighborhood as we have now. As Joseph said, I published a piece in Foreign Policy earlier this month, arguing that this could be the first Latin America first administration in our lifetimes, but it wouldn't be the first Latin America first administration. And Joseph hinted at this in his comments. The U.S. is reverting back to an old policy, which is focusing itself on its shared neighborhood, on its near abroad, where it needs a zone of security. And the reverting back to this policy is not new. It's something we've done throughout history periodically, but it's new to those of us who are working on this issue now, because we've been off in other theaters of the world for many, many years with the counterterrorism elements of our foreign policy, obviously with the fascination with competing in the Indo-Pacific, taking us away for a while as well. You've had administration after administration promising that Latin America is going to be a focus, really going back to George W. Bush as a border state governor, and then getting pulled away into other theaters of the world. I think with the Trump administration, you really do have a chance to keep that promise in terms of the focus on the Western Hemisphere. So there's that. And then I think there's the old Reagan era mantra that personnel is policy. And that was the other point that I was trying to make in my piece in the Foreign Policy magazine is, in my lifetime, we've never seen, there's never been a Hispanic Secretary of State. So we have Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State. Joseph mentioned Chris Landau as the Deputy Secretary. I don't know if the two of us will be living through another period of time where there are Latin Americanists in the #1 and #2 position at State Department. There might not be. Where there is a Latin Americanist or someone who's versed in Latin America topics, certainly from his time on the HVAC as a member of the House of Representatives, Mike Waltz, the NSA position, where there's a high-level special envoy, Mauricio Claver-Caron, for Latin America and the State Department, and probably others that will come into the administration in the coming months to continue building the profile of individuals working on Latin America. So it's not just that President Trump has put this issue front and center of the agenda with what he wants to accomplish, but also the personnel that are being selected for positions are very Latin America focused. The through line of everything, starting with the Monroe Doctrine, I think is the piece that Joseph was hinting at, but I'll try to tease out a little bit more. It's this zone of security for the United States, what we've called in a couple papers the policy of strategic denial. Right, we need to deny our adversaries the ability to have such free reign in our shared neighborhood, because it's really the only, unless we're talking about a hypersonic missile, it's really the only possible way that a threat vector could present itself to the United States via Latin America. And so there's a real reason to have a policy of strategic denial. And I think you can see bits of strategic denial in the Second World War, in the Cold War period. This is the way in which this policy kind of continues as the through line, and the way in which the U.S. is reverting back to this old policy. We haven't seen it in more than 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, but we're reverting back to this idea. With that said, I think one of the biggest foci we need to have in this administration is on China and China's role in this hemisphere. And I will focus the rest of my opening remarks on China because I think this occupies a lot of my time on the day-to-day, but also I think it's fair to say that of all of our strategic rivals, China's the most capable. It's the most all-comprehensive. It engages in the most wide-ranging way with Latin America. There's plenty of presence of Russia, plenty of presence of Iran, some presence of North Korea. I would guide you all to Joseph's excellent work on those topics as well. But I do think that the China threat is sort of above all of those in the sense that it's really all-encompassing. We've seen in the last 2 decades, trade between the region and China grow about tenfold. We've seen 5 free trade agreements in the region with China. We've seen 2 countries currently negotiating free trade agreements with China. The FDI numbers in the region are quite frightening. If you are a U.S. Latin Americanist, about 160 billion in Chinese foreign direct investment in the last decade and a half. To give you just a snapshot of how much China has improved its position in Latin America in the last decade and a half, let me just give you 2 kind of snapshots in time. 2002, trade with the region, two-way trade with the region, about 18 billion. 2022, 450 billion. So we're seeing China expand its tentacles throughout the region. And first and foremost, of course, the expansion is economic in nature. But I don't want to dwell too much on the economic piece of it because as we've seen, China engages, or the first foray might be on the economic axis or domain, but then it quickly moves out from there into other domains as well. The bilateral trade increases, then China gets countries to accede to the BRI. Then after the BRI, it starts putting Confucius Institutes in your country. After the Confucius Institutes, the International Liaison Department starts inviting your mainstream political parties to come and have junkets in Beijing, hang out with the CCP. Who knows what else happens at some of those meetings because the readouts from them are very anodyne. All we get is kind of basic stuff on the ILD's website. But clearly, all of this is part of an engagement strategy that's more than just economic in nature. And increasingly of concern for me, in recent years, we've seen China increase its defense and security cooperation with the region. An area where the U.S. and the Southern Command has had a clear advantage in recent decades. We're still the partner of choice in many ways in this domain, but the Chinese are gaining, and they're using the economic foray into some of their relationships in the region to engage in things like defense and security cooperation, as well as other things. So I could continue going on down the list, but I think the refocus that we're getting from the Trump administration on Latin America needs to be most of all focused on China's efforts in the hemisphere and rolling back some of those efforts, both by playing defense, as we're seeing with President Trump in the Panama Canal. I would say that we were kind of asleep at the switch for a little while, and we're now realizing that Hutchison Ports operating ports at both ends of the canal is actually a strategic risk for us. And now the question is, what do we do about it? But also going on offense, right? Seeing more private sector engagement with the region, seeing more other types of engagements such that the Chinese offer is not the only offer to the region in really important spaces like ports, telecoms, and other critical infrastructure. So I'll end it there and hope we've generated plenty of questions for an interesting discussion.
Thank you, Ryan. Indeed, China is and seems to be the main focus, but there are other actors as well that present a national security threat or could. I wanted to invite you, Joseph, briefly to talk a bit about what it might mean for President Trump to designate the cartels as a terrorist organization and what you have seen in the region from Iran in particular and Hezbollah. And then I think we'll end up focusing a lot more on China, but I want to make sure we get these topics in early in case it generates some questions. So Joseph, could you comment on that as well, please?
Yeah, sure. So let me take those as kind of two separate, you know, the cartels in one, and then we can talk a little about Iran. And that actually fuses into China as well, and I could leave it at that, and then we could open up the conversation. So everyone, I think, might be aware, if you're not aware, one of the first executive orders that President Trump signed on January 20th was an executive order to designate transnational criminal organizations as foreign terrorist organizations. And it gives about 14 days to the Secretary of State and others in his cabinet to start to evaluate which specific TCOs will be designated as such. And there's some obvious ones like the Tren de Aragua from Venezuela that we designate as foreign terrorist organizations. But what really I think that executive order did, and I'm going to unpack this a little bit, is it used very advanced concepts that were once really only discussed in the defense and intelligence community, debated for many years, but concepts that are really modernizing the counter-transnational organized crime effort. Let me break those down a little bit. The first is convergence, threat convergence, crime-terror convergence. And what convergence really is, and this is something that the Department of Defense really wrestled with for a long time, and it has to do with the topic of criminals and drug cartels working in symbiosis with international terrorist organizations, particularly jihadist terrorist organizations from the Middle East. Something that in a post-9/11 environment, many people thought would not happen because their motives are different, right? You have political grievances versus profits. You have just a different kind of objective, if you want to say it, from these two different entities. What we found empirically was that's not the case. That in fact these two phenomenons work very well together, not because they have the same objectives, but they have the same logistics. You know, in the military we have this refrain that says amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. And when you look at the logistical networks, if you're a service provider for a major drug cartel, what's a service provider? It's a truck driver, it's an accountant, it's a IT technician. If you're a service provider for a cartel, and then Al Qaeda comes and wants to do an operation or carry out something in that territory, you're a good candidate to be a service provider for that terrorist organization as well, because you're already in that illicit enterprise. And so what happens is these illicit logistical actors begin to grow the illicit economies, and the illicit economies become so powerful because they're servicing multiple illicit activities. And so convergence is a concept that was debated, but I think has really been past the debate at this point, and now it's part of executive authority. The second one is called complex adaptive systems. And complex adaptive systems actually comes from social systems theory. It's basically more of a science and engineering term. And what it has to do is what happens when you have like certain systems that adapt to conditions. And when they adapt to conditions, they basically evolve. And how this applies to TCOs is that pretty much since the DEA created a kingpin strategy to go after kingpins, the cartels adapted from the kingpin model. So basically, and then, you know, the easy example of this is the Sinaloa cartel and Chapo Guzman. Chapo Guzman was the leader of the Sinaloa cartel. He got arrested multiple times. Eventually, he got extradited to the United States. The Sinaloa cartel did not lose a dollar. Their operations continued to operate, and in many ways increased it on many of the fronts that they were operating in. And what that meant is that the Sinaloa cartel had a long time ago adapted from a kingpin strategy, kingpin model, to a complex adaptive system where territorial capture and territorial control is more important to them than one or two, three key figures at the core of the cartel. There's arguments that the Zetas made this really like the big shift in this earlier on, and I argue that today almost all TCOs operate that way, including Tren de Aragua, and so territory becomes that much more important. And really, kingpins you don't really see anymore, other than in like Netflix series and things like that. They're not really a modern application of TCOs. And then the last concept was asymmetric warfare, and I had not seen asymmetric warfare discussed in an executive order before, and this was a very appropriate time to introduce it, because cartels, TCOs, and terrorists are no longer operating in just the illicit activities in which they're designed for. They're operating as components and tools of bigger regimes, even China. And when we talk about fentanyl, China employs fentanyl as a strategy of warfare. It doesn't employ fentanyl as just a way to make money, which is mostly criminal activity. And in many respects, the Mexican cartels kind of adopted that mindset and started to employ their tactics in a much more kind of mindset of attacking rather than doing just traditional business, even if it's illicit business. And so that's, I think, what we saw with this designation. there's some practical applications of it. I mean, for the longest time, and I think Ryan mentioned this, I think I mentioned it, counterterrorism has been at the lead of U.S. national security efforts. So our authorities, whether it's Title 10, Title 50 authorities, on basically going after terrorists, supersede a lot of what we do on counter-transnational organized crime, particularly in the financial domain. And so this allows us now to use those authorities against cartels as well. And,
right.
and fundamentally, and with this, we were able to, I think, in the stroke of a pen by President Trump's signature, take counter-transnational organized crime to the 21st century. It's now up there as one of the highest priorities for the United States, and giving through executive power, all the tools to our law enforcement and military and national security apparatus to deal with these different groups. So I'll do that. We can talk about it around later.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Very interesting indeed how the cartel logistical network supports other adversarial efforts, which ties back to China. And so, Ryan, you mentioned some staggering stats, and the amount of terrain that China has won in the last decade and a half. It's incredible. I invite you, Ryan, first, and Joseph, if you want to comment as well afterwards. What are some of the tactics that China has employed in the hemisphere to gain so much influence? Isn't it just that they are better at the economic trade terms and therefore perhaps it's fair? Or are there ways in which they engage which are non-economic and therefore require governmental action from a national security perspective? Please comment.
That's a terrific question, Eric. So as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think that the Chinese engagement tends to begin as an economic engagement. But from there, it branches out into a bunch of different types of engagement. China has been incredibly deft at a number of things. So first is funneling that engagement into other types of engagement. You might think that you are just getting more Chinese investment in your country, but pretty soon you're kind of being coerced or coaxed into signing the Belt and Road Initiative, or you're getting coaxed into signing another deal that gives elements of your telecoms away to Huawei or something like that. You think you're getting one thing, but then a bunch of Chinese state-owned enterprises come along with another thing. I mentioned the party-to-party apparatus. I mentioned the way in which China engages in the security domain. So it tends to go into other domains really quickly. One of the things that China has been very deft at doing as well is kind of probing around the edges of a lot of democratic institutions and finding weak points, finding either individuals who are co-optable or finding weak points in democratic institutions and exploiting them. And that's the case in much of Latin America. We're talking about a region that is, yes, largely democratic, but also mostly new democracies that are in many cases, 20, 30 years old, and where institutions aren't completely consolidated, where corruption is unfortunately far too common, and where still far too many elites remain open to being co-opted or potentially coerced. And we've seen a number of instances of that. I think China as well, Eric, they're very good at deploying resources both federally and locally. So China a lot of times has a strategy, what we say going local, in countries like Colombia, Argentina, Brazil. Sometimes the Chinese are visiting areas of the country that haven't seen a visit from a U.S. diplomatic official in years, decades, right? If you're a small municipality in Patagonia, for example, you are not used to seeing a delegation of Chinese commercial interests, diplomatic interests, that would normally be kind of a federal level delegation in your, say, 1,000 person municipality. That's just not normal. And yet what is on the table is some kind of strategic project, as happened with the space station in Neuquén province, where China now operates through an institution that's related to the PLA, a space station in the middle of the Patagonian desert. So decisions can be made on a very, very local level that have extremely wide-ranging geopolitical ramifications. But the individuals who are taking those decisions in the moment they're certainly not thinking about the geopolitical ramifications on a regional scale. They think, oh, I'm just getting more investment from my municipality. I'm building my relationship with China. It's great that we have this this diplomatic visit where a bunch of Chinese entrepreneurs are descending on our small town, and they don't think or understand the kind of broader geopolitical consequences to some of the decisions that they make, and nevertheless they have a kind of cascading effect. So the Chinese have been very deft over the years.
That's a great point, and I can attest through firsthand experience, indeed, how disproportionately impactful some of these attentions to hyper-local jurisdictions can be. I mean, they feel so special that a delegation comes and visits them when the U.S., generally stays at a federal level. Indeed. Now, one of the things I have observed as well is how the environment for just doing business, especially with FCPA for U.S. enterprise, becomes less and less conducive for American enterprises to just operate. And this is true in big operations, as now recently with the Panama Canal coming into the spotlight, no companies actually bidding to operate those ports, or in Honduras with the railroad, I'm really finding difficulty getting bids, or in Peru. I mean, so big projects, but also not so big projects, just day-to-day operations deciding to close down because the legal environment is just not conducive to an FCPA way of doing business. Any comments on the role that China is playing, if any, in transforming the environments to do business in the region so as to discourage American enterprise from operating?
You want to
That's
take?
Open to either, but Joseph, I know this is a topic you've looked at yourself, so why don't you start?
No, I'll point to Ryan to answer that, because I'm going to add a little bit later on a little big picture what China's doing.
Okay, go Ryan.
I would say it's a great point, Eric. I think one of the things that when the U.S. was the only player in town, we could basically assert that the U.S. private sector, one of the best things that we can unleash for development prospects in the region, it requires certain things. You need to reform this, you need to reform that, you need anti-corruption measures, and so on. We would come with our list, and countries would have to do their best to meet us on some of those things because, of course, they wanted the U.S. private sector to be present. What I would say with China is that they're willing to reward bad economic policies and bad behavior with state-centered investment or state-owned enterprise investment, because it's just a different model. The CCP can tell Chinese state-owned enterprises where they should invest, not because it makes good economic sense, but because it's strategic, and they have to do it because they're deferential to the state, of course. And so what you have is then a reinforcement of this idea that you don't need to engage in reforms to get significant levels of investment. You can just get it from China. And so one of the things we've seen over the last decade or so is governments that are not putting in place good economic policies, good anti-corruption measures, and so on, nevertheless getting rewarded with big contracts from China and a lot of FDI. And to your point, Eric, much less U.S. private sector engagement, because they're either worried about the overall economic environment or they're worried about the criminality of everything with FCPA. And so the lesson is, you don't need to reform to get the private sector interested. You can just rely on China, and that has kind of encouraged or allowed countries to double down on some of their very deleterious policies when it comes to building a good business environment.
Yeah, great point. And so that puts American enterprise at a bit of a catch-22, and the U.S. government as well. Does the U.S. as a policy relax the conditions under which it's willing to support U.S. investment, and therefore perhaps move away from some core principles, or does it find a way to exert pressure so that at a national level, countries, let's say, are up in the way of doing business versus not? And perhaps there are alternatives, and that's maybe where prosperity zones can play a role. But Joseph, I think you wanted to jump in with a broader comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think just wanted to piggyback on what Ryan was saying on China, and fundamentally, I think there's a U.S. component to this. I think we've sent all the wrong signals about China for far too long. And we, U.S. policy on China has been kind of bipolar for a long time. And I think in the early part of the century, we had kind of a misperception of how China was going to reform its political system, come into the kind of the world of democratic nation states. We had a lot of aspirations, and this goes to, to Henry Kissinger's view all the way back in the 20th century. And these were basically very large aspirations that never really materialized. And I think we waited too long to realize that this is not going in this direction, and particularly when Xi Jinping took the reign and hardened China's positions on a lot of these issues. And we never sent those signals down to Latin America. So Latin America was like, well, you guys are trading with China. You guys are doing all this with China. Like, why can't we do it? And it was all kind of very dyslexic. So I've been working with Indo-PACOM for about 2 years now on both studies and seminars related to China. None of it's really public, but I can share some things with you guys. And what I'm most concerned with, right? Space, cyber, and maritime. Those are the things that I'm most concerned with. China's involved in all kinds of things, political things. They're involved in all kinds of different investments, authoritarianism, disinformation. But I'm worried about those things because they have fundamental ways of changing the way geography is moved inside Latin America, developing alternative trade routes, developing new shipping lanes, things that really, what Sir Walter Raleigh said, if you control the water, you control the world, and things that what this Belt and Road Initiative thing is really all designed to do is create new waterways, new choke points. And so in that, and I could go a little bit, Chile keeps me up at night about what's going on down there. Honduras, obviously I've visited Honduras. I think that's a nascent project, but I think it's something that needs to divert attention to. What they're doing in Mexico, I think, is obviously Mexico has large proximity to the United States. But when we get into and this is where I really want to make my point, all these conversations in the lens of an academic or a diplomat or an economist, these are commercial conversations. But in my lens, as a national security scholar, these are all conversations on warfare. Those are also three domains of war, right? Cyberspace and maritime. And warfare in all its complexity can be simplified into one term, compulsion. If I compel my adversary to bend to my will, I win that war. It does not require military force. I could do it through subversion. I could do it through sabotage. I could do it in many different ways. The whole Sun Tzu, subdue the enemy without fighting. So in China, it's important for, I think, Latin Americans to start to get smart about China and start to study their doctrine, understand how they operate, and things that have helped me understand this as I've kind of gone through this journey. A comprehensive national power. That's an important term for China. They don't measure the world the way we measure it here in the West. Matter of fact, there's two ways to think about this simplistically in terms of power projection, right? One is to grow, right? You project your power by building your military, by growing your economy, and you project it abroad. China does some of that too. But fundamentally, when you're not growing anymore, how do you continue to project power? You tear everybody else down, right? So when you tear everybody else down, you appear to be stronger, and perception is key. And so comprehensive national power has a range of metrics. I think it's over 40 metrics that they use to be able to measure China's power in the world. And some of it's all done on how to play the perceptions along those numbers and metrics. Another concept is military-civil fusion, right? And this, I think, goes to the core of where Latin America, and I think, really missed the beat on when it comes to China. Because there's this myth that with Chinese trade and Chinese investment comes this great economic boom. Well, show me the case study. I'm still waiting to see it in Africa, in Latin America. Panama is a great example, right? China's been in Panama for more than 20 years, but China really got politically active in Panama after 2017. And after 2017, Panama signed the Belt and Road Initiative. They reneged on the diplomatic recognition of Taiwan in favor of the PRC. They gave concessions to China to do the expansion of the port. And not just the port holding companies, but the construction companies that were building the bridge and everything else. And where has Panama gone as a country in economic development since 2017? It's actually, for those of us that visited Panama many times, it used to be the Miami of the Western Hemisphere, growing at 10 to 12% a year in 2010, 11, 12. It's now a shell of that. So where does all this Chinese activity actually help the development of that country? And the last is one that I think it's one that really gets talked a lot about, but I don't know why in Latin America they haven't really focused on, is unrestricted warfare, right? And it's a book by two PLA colonels that basically blew the whistle on this back in 1999. It got translated by the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and I recommend everyone read that book. I think it is in Spanish as well. It talks about 26 forms of warfare, which includes drug warfare and fentanyl. But it can be summed up into basically anything goes. China's whole strategy is to get the United States to submit, to get us to quit, to get us to give up without having a confrontation. It doesn't benefit them to have any confrontation with the United States. That's why I think in Taiwan, I mean, no one can predict the future. I don't know exactly what will happen in Taiwan, but I'm actually more worried about the Philippines and the Scarborough Shoal, because they will drive conflicts in the South China Sea to complicate our positioning in the Indo-Pacific, so that the United States will get engaged and then eventually give up. And that maneuvering is what they're planning to take to the Caribbean, and they're positioning themselves to do this. So I just wanted to add to that to say that, from the lens of national security, a lot of China's commercial endeavors are fundamentally military ambitions that they're pre-positioning into Latin America, using all these fancy terms like comprehensive national power, military subfusion, unrestricted warfare, but fundamentally that's their desired end state. And as China's economy is not really going to grow much more, the commodity supercycle that fueled a lot of this during the earlier part of the century is over. China has a housing crisis, they have a demographic crisis, they have an inflation crisis, and Xi Jinping is coming to the end of his political road. What was going to be 2049, the 100-year revolution, is now sped up to 2030. Now that could be potentially challenging if a conflict erupts, but it's incumbent on us as the United States to work with Latin America to make sure that we avoid this at all costs. So I think there's a huge education effort that has to happen in the region, and I think a lot of Latin American leaders need to start thinking, what did we go wrong? Just like the United States, we have to think, where did we go wrong? Like, we went wrong on our foreign policy on China. Well, I think a lot of Latin American governments are going to have that same kind of inflection on where they went wrong as well, and we can help them. I mean, we learned the lesson the hard way as well, so I think we can help on all this.
Okay, I've been tracking several of the questions adding up here, and they are very focused on the very current events, the Rubio trip to the region and what we can read into it, some of the Taiwan activity and how it compares to China, and then some specific questions to comments either of you two made. The last question from the prepared ones I wanted to ask, and then we'll jump into these more current events, if you will, questions, is, and Joseph, you mentioned it, you can project power by growing or by tearing down. Perhaps China indeed will slow down over the coming decade, and their growth capacity won't be as significant as it has been. But the US also has the potential to continue to grow in the hemisphere. What are some of the best and promising ways to counter this trend in our hemisphere? What should the US be doing? Should it be primarily military? Should it come with supporting US enterprises investing in the hemisphere? And if so, how do you deal with this dynamic that you mentioned, Ryan, where the Chinese don't put any, conditions? Why would an American company win out when the US government requires all sorts of higher standards? So can you perhaps, and it won't be exactly a super short, but, in a minute or so, mention some of the key initiatives that you think are either underway or could be implemented to counter Chinese influence in the region? And Ryan, maybe you want to go first, then Joseph, and then I'll field some of these other questions.
Sure. Let me just touch on the commercial aspect, and maybe I'll kick over the military aspects to Joseph. I think it's competition needs to be in multiple domains, but let me just do the commercial aspect, because again, I truly believe that as a conservative, the best thing that we can do is unleash the private sector in investments in places that are tilting towards China, because again, you can bring Western capital to bear in countries that are flirting with China. You can really bring them back into the orbit. So I think it's going to have to take some significant both offense and defense. So we put out a paper about a year and a half ago now called "Insulate, Curtail, Compete." Just a quick phrase to try to remember the strategy. I mean, I think getting to the point that I made before, we need to be very careful about how China co-ops leadership in the region and ensnares politicians and institutions and corruption. So insulate against some of these really weak and vulnerable points. But also, we need to decide where the critical areas are for us to compete. We can't compete everywhere. Resources are limited. And so that's why we need to have a serious conversation, and I don't think we've had this yet, about which areas where we want to compete. Is it telecoms? Is it space? Is it ports and maritime infrastructure? Is it some combination thereof? We need to have a serious conversation about where we're going to spend what is by definition limited: resources, focus, policy efforts. And then once we've figured out those areas, we need to curtail, meaning go to certain countries and say, we just can't accept that you choose China as your preferred partner in these areas. And then ideally marry those requests for curtailment with some kind of competition, meaning a viable alternative that's Western oriented, democratic saving and facing in nature. And I'm a bit agnostic. Great if it's a US private sector company. I'm also aware of the fact that there are other companies in other democratic regions in Europe, in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, that could be just as good, right? So we need to be aware of some of those areas where maybe we don't have a US company that's super great at offering a telecoms alternative. But we've got Nokia, we've got Ericsson, we've got other offers that are, we think, democracy preserving. Why don't we do something to make those more attractive than Huawei, for example?
Perfect. Thank you. Joseph?
Yeah, I mean, we don't do well in the United States with government-to-government trade. I mean, it's just not our forte. Our government's very large, it's very cumbersome, it's slow. Markets are very dynamic, they're fast. And I think where we beat China every day of the week is in capital markets. We do that all over the world. And when we unleash the capital markets into any part of the world, we basically crowd out whatever China's trying to do, because as much as what they do maybe outpacing us in certain parts of the world, in Latin America and Africa, it's still slow, it's still cumbersome, because it's still centralized to Beijing. The challenge with capital markets is we have to convince private investors that there's stability in Latin America, and that's a very hard sell when there's gangs and TCOs. I think security is a precondition to a lot of the things that we want to do to compete with China. On the military side, I think I'm a big fan of defense diplomacy and defense education. In fact, China stole our model. They basically looked at what National Defense University was doing in Latin America and then just added a nicer hotel and a bigger per diem. And they brought everybody over to China to be able to study over there. And, for Latin America, getting an all expense paid trip to anywhere is really an attractive offer. I mean, they don't get to travel much, and the governments don't have a lot of budgets for that kind of thing. So I think with a very fraction of what it costs for a F-35 or some big nice armament, we can do a lot on defense diplomacy and defense education, plussing up the budgets of the elements of defense that do that kind of work. And then another one's a plug to you, Eric. I mean, I was able to go to Honduras in these opportunity zones. I think this is a very innovative way to challenge China. The thing is, China wants to do the same thing. They want their own opportunity zones, but they want their opportunity zones to have their characteristics, right? And in fact, what they're doing, like what Ryan mentioned, Noken. Well, Noken's like an opportunity zone for them, right? Except it has a military ambition, but they basically acquire territory within the sovereign state of a sovereign country of Argentina. And then they were able to hoodwink the Argentines into basically giving that territory by creating a cross-default clause in all the contracts, so that if they try to renegotiate this military station, a space tracking station, they have to renegotiate everything, and Argentina is just not in an economic position to do so. So they were very clever about how they did that. But I think the United States could work with groups like you guys and others to be able to find where Americans are already investing in Latin America, and all they really need is for the bureaucracy to get out of the way, and I think that our embassies can do a better job at that and helping to curtail that. I know in countries like in Honduras, it's much more difficult. The challenge is a lot harder, and you have rule of law challenges there. But fundamentally, there's places, and like I mentioned, Guyana. Guyana is a place where China has made a lot of investments. It's the largest growing country in the world, 35% per year, after they had this large discovery of offshore oil. But they're also begging for U.S. investment, and there are American companies. Exxon's the biggest, but there are American companies that are investing into Exxon, but they're having a hard time getting through the red tape. And I think that that's something the American government can help with if we apply ourselves to that. So I will leave it at that. I think capital markets, I think I like the opportunity zones, defense diplomacy, defense education, are non-kinetic ways to basically not have to go in there with a big stick and basically go into Latin America and convince Latin Americans that we're for real. And I think there's a reality perception thing. The challenge with China, this is their weakness. The challenge with China and Latin America is they have to make a lot of things up. They have to convince people of something that's not empirically proven. We can actually show them reality, but we have to do it in a way that's credible. And that's, I think, the challenge the United States has right now as we're re-engaging the region. I say re-engaging, and we've been there, but we haven't really been there, as we described and Ryan mentioned, like in the way that we see this opportunity today. But we have a credibility problem because people in Latin America take the United States as kind of like equivalent to that friend that comes to your house, drinks your beer, and leaves. Like, we basically come in very transactionally. We ask for something, we take something, we give something, and then we're off to do something else in some other place and we don't hear from us. And then you come down to Washington, it's very hard to get a meeting. So we have to reestablish that credibility and that consistency that will allow Latin Americans to be like, you know what, America's for real now. And I think then once we do that, things like the Panama Canal, these conversations start opening up, because fundamentally Latin Americans, and I say this kind of, very confidently, prefer the United States to China across the board. And I think once that is presented that way, they'll make the right choice.
Thanks, Joseph. And you indirectly answered one of the key questions, and talking about, the Trump administration has 4 years. What are some of the deep structural initiatives that can be put in place to counter China? And I think you talked about defense diplomacy, you talked about opportunity/prosperity zones. So these are all things that will outlast any given administration. And in the last minute that we have here, one of you two is going to have to pick what meaning do we give the Rubio trip with regards to the countries that he picked and the ones that he left out, in particular as it relates to messaging China, if any. Either of you want to take that on, Ryan?
I can do it in 30 seconds and give 30 seconds to Joseph. Here we go. So look, folks, the fact that Marco Rubio in his first trip as Secretary of State is going to Latin America is an important message that we may not see again in our lifetimes. And again, I think it's doubling down on this idea that Latin America is going to be a priority for the administration. There's a lot of stuff going on in other parts of the world. If you look at where previous Secretaries of State states took their first trips, nowhere near Latin America, right? Germany's sometimes an option, Israel, Japan, other places. Latin America is usually not on the map. Latin America being on the map is a message. And then second brief comment in terms of the places that he selected. Obviously, Panama, incredibly important, featured in the president's inaugural address. Canal, migration. Guatemala, the Dominican Republic. These are all places where migration, but also the nearshoring conversation, the movement of supply chains is incredibly important. Notice as well the country that's not in the itinerary. It's Honduras. And it's because I think the administration is not sure it can have a good relationship with Honduras, given the way that the Xiomara Castro government has positioned itself vis-a-vis the Trump administration on issues like migration, the Sotocano base, and other things that are of strategic importance to the United States. So I think where Rubio will not be is also just as important as where he will be.
Excellent. Any quick comments on your end, Joseph?
No, I mean, I agree. I think Secretary Rubio said it himself. He said the United States will no longer ignore our near abroad. He will no longer ignore Latin America, and he's the perfect secretary to say that with a lot of credibility. And he doesn't need preparation for his trip because he's prepared over his career. He knows the region probably better than anybody. And just one last thing, I think, what happened with Colombia, the diplomatic spat that happened with Colombia about a week ago, I think sent a strong reverberating message throughout Latin America, because they're used to the United States being very soft and not very, not being acting up or following up on its strategic intentions. And I think now most of Latin America realizes that deportation of the criminals from the United States is a high, the first tier priority for the United States. We will not allow our country to be invaded by criminals, terrorists, and other nefarious actors that have come in through bad immigration policies or a weak border. And I think that with President Petro having to walk that back and then having to cancel their SELAC meeting in Honduras, it showed that that there's a strength coming back to the region, and I think Latin Americans respect that, fundamentally respect strength. There's a very kind of strong aspect to the culture. So no, with that, I think that's it for me.
Great. Well, our time has come. Wanted to again thank each of you for participating. I hope the attendees found the discussion of great value. And Caroline, heading it back to you to wrap it up. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Eric. Well, on behalf of the Federalist Society, I want to thank our speakers for the benefit of their time and expertise today. Thank you also to the audience members who joined us. We greatly appreciate your participation. Check out our website, fedsoc.org, or follow us on all major social media platforms at FedSoc to stay up to date with announcements and upcoming webinars. Thank you once more for tuning in. And with that, we are adjourned.